Why are all you people leaving? Where are you going? This is like the highlight panel of the entire day happening right now. Thank you very much, Mom. I appreciate that. You have to be able to pack the panel. Can I just say before...
You made good on your promise to make people laugh, so...
Well, it's very, very nerve-wracking to come on after that last panel. Those were very funny people.
Yeah.
But can I just say how nice? I've been sitting in the audience for the morning and for most of this day. It's so nice to be sitting in a room with like actual live human beings and not just like going through my Twitter feed all day looking to see what incredibly crazy thing just happened in the world. It's really a nice way to spend the day. Awesome.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, Eric. For those of you who haven't already bought this book, Palaces for the People, you definitely should do that. And I guess before I jump into this, I want to just make a quick shout out to the Knight Foundation, which has been supportive of all of today's events, but particularly this panel, because we're going to be talking about some of the ideas that align with the Knight Foundation's work on civic commons. So you've just come out with this book, Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life. And I've followed your work for many years, going from books like Heat Wave and Going Solo, and now this one. Tell us a little bit about what social infrastructure is and how some of your previous work has led you to this topic.
Yeah, so thank you. Social infrastructure is probably a pretty new concept for most people, and I mean it in a very specific way. And I think the best way for me to introduce it to you is to tell you how I came to think that it was a valuable idea. It actually came from the first big research project I ever did, which is where this Palaces for the People book begins also, a study of this incredible heat wave that hit Chicago in 1995. And I'm guessing not everyone in the room has heard of the great Chicago heat wave of 1995, but and that's actually part of this reason I did this book. Is it was a massively lethal event. More than 700 people died from a heat wave that lasted just a couple days, and what I wanted to do is understand why that happened and why we failed to register it. And the first thing I did for the project, because I'm also a sociologist, is to go to the city and kind of map the deaths. And the first thing I found is exactly what you would expect to find, that the neighborhoods in Chicago that are most vulnerable, this segregated, largely African-American neighborhoods, very poor on the south sides and the west sides, were most at risk. And that wasn't very interesting at all. It was like, it's politically very important that we have great capacity to predict with near certainty which places and which people are going to be affected by these extreme weather events. And it's politically important to note that despite that, time after time, we fail to protect people. But scientifically, it's not that interesting. But what was scientifically really amazing and puzzling is that it turned out that if you looked among the neighborhoods in Chicago that should have done really badly, a bunch of them did. But a lot of neighborhoods that looked on paper identical to the places that had really high death rates turned out to be the safest places, the most resilient, I guess is the concept we use these days, even safer than the places on the kind of very opulent, affluent north side. And so I wanted to figure out why is it that, say, like imagine like everyone on the right side of this auditorium now, you live in a neighborhood that looks very vulnerable and lots of people die, and everyone on the left side of the auditorium, people miraculously stayed alive. So what was it, since demographically you're the same? And it turns out the neighborhoods that were vulnerable, like on the right side, there's a lot of displacement and abandonment and depletion. And so you had empty lots and you had abandoned buildings and parks that weren't used very well and weren't maintained very well and very little commercial activity on the streets. And I know there's actually a lot of stuff that looks like this in Philadelphia, right? So you can probably see this kind of neighborhood. And it turns out if you live in a place like this, you're much less likely to go out into the public realm and get to know people around you. And so if there's a crisis, you're even more likely to kind of stay home and hunker down, and people don't know to knock on your door. So in neighborhoods like this, the death rate was massive. But in neighborhoods on this side of the room, the population was largely intact. There was very little abandonment and depletion. There were more block clubs, more nonprofit organizations, things like branch libraries and churches that were doing outreach. And so people in those neighborhoods, they knew each other all the time, and they were also much more capable of protecting each other when something scary came around. And I came to think of the differences between this side and that side as differences that were about social infrastructure. And I define that as the physical places and the organizations that shape our interactions. And what I now believe is that there's a social infrastructure that supports our capacity or detracts from our capacity to engage one another that's just as real as the infrastructure for things like water or transit or energy. And if we abandon it and we let it go to waste, we all suffer the consequences.
So you mentioned your Twitter feed and the crazy things that are going on in the country these days. Why do you think this topic is so important right now? Is it these political polarizing events or climate change and increasing climate disasters? Why is this an issue for 2018 and beyond?
I think there's so many reasons that we need to be talking about social infrastructure right now, to the growing feeling that we have become polarized and divided like never before, and we find it very difficult to recognize the humanity of people who disagree with us and who are different from us, let alone the capacity to forge common interest and engage in politics. But there's pragmatic reasons as well, namely that our systems, the infrastructure systems that support modern societies around the world are breaking down. And according to the World Bank, we will soon be investing trillions of dollars around the world, and it will be hundreds of billions to begin with in this country, in infrastructure. And it seems to me like if we can recognize that social infrastructure is vital in the same way that the kind of traditional forms of infrastructure are, we develop a menu of possibilities for policymaking and investing in our cities that's very different than the one that we see right now. So we probably aren't going to get Infrastructure Week anytime soon because people are pretty preoccupied these days. It's probably a very good thing. But when Infrastructure Week does come around, and it will inevitably, there are a number of ways that we can strengthen our communities and our cities that aren't currently on the table. And I think one really interesting thing about infrastructure, despite the fact that we spend so much money on it, is it has largely been a topic that's in the domain of the technocrats and experts who tell us that infrastructure is too sophisticated for you as citizens to understand, so just trust us to get it right. They haven't gotten it right, and I think it's in our collective interest as members of a democratic society to develop our own political vocabulary for engaging in infrastructure debates.
So we've been talking about this concept of social infrastructure, but I want to get to a couple of specific examples. And when I was reading the book, I was really pleased to see that there's an example here in Philadelphia, or a couple, and particularly on some research being done between some professors at the University of Pennsylvania in collaboration with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. And what they were doing was looking at vacant lots and seeing how those that were maintained in various different ways, how they might, or maintained or not maintained, affect crime, violence, and health. Can you talk a little bit about what the researchers found and whether this kind of finding has particular relevance about how we think about places as both bridging that social infrastructure and the physical infrastructure of our places?
Yeah, very, very much. And so again, the idea in the book is that we can generate benefits from investing in the physical places where we make our lives in ways that we haven't fully appreciated. And in fact, one of the most compelling cases for this comes from this project in Philadelphia. And the origins of my engagement with it were that, because I'm a social scientist, and so I think a lot about the big theories from the social sciences that have shaped policymaking in cities in the past. And if not the most influential theory that's touched cities in the last several decades is this theory of broken windows policing. Do you guys know this broken windows policing? Has it entered your world? So the theory, I haven't heard one hiss, so you're a very civil group here in Philadelphia. You get a lot of hisses when you talk about broken windows policing in New York City. There it is. Now I feel like I'm back at home. So broken windows came from these very eminent political scientists, J.Q. Wilson and George Kelling, and article that they originally wrote came out in the Atlantic Monthly Magazine. It was called Broken Windows, and people think of it as like the Bible of the criminal justice movement, and it basically it got translated as the idea that if there are broken windows in a neighborhood, that people who are potentially going to commit crime will see those windows as a sign of not just disorder, but also of a lack of local control. And what they'll do is they'll interpret the meaning to be that you can kind of get away with what you want to get away with here. And so the policy response to broken windows was send in lots of police officers and do zero tolerance policing, do stop and frisk. It was basically one of the engines that made mass incarceration possible. And I had this really radical idea once upon a time, which was like, what would have happened if our response to broken windows theory was to fix the windows? I'm from Chicago. I'm kind of a pragmatic guy. I was like, we could probably do this differently, And then I went back and looked at the article, and it turns out like the string of events that get you to broken windows are, in the original article, houses are abandoned, weeds grow, windows are broken, and then there's graffiti and lots of crime. And it always occurred to me that like if this article weren't published in a glossy magazine, no one would have thought, oh, you know what? Abandoned houses is a crappy title. Broken windows, that works, And maybe in history could have been different. So as it happens, I wasn't the only one who had this question. What would happen if you had kind of fixed up the social infrastructure in a neighborhood? And this group of professors at Penn started working with the city of Philadelphia and with the Horticultural Society in Pennsylvania. And as you know, there are tens of thousands of empty lots and abandoned buildings around Philadelphia, just like there are in Detroit and Chicago and Kansas City. So many industrial cities that saw population loss with deindustrialization. And they started this project that was an experiment. What would happen if you invested modest resources in fixing up the empty lots so that instead of having debris and garbage in a place that basically provided spatial conditions for crime, you converted them into pocket parks, put wooden post fences around, a bench, maybe planted a tree, made them pleasant places in the neighborhood, and then also boarded up abandoned buildings so that you couldn't reuse them for criminal purposes. Because it turns out, like if you're in a neighborhood, these abandoned places, they're not just sources of blight. They also feel like they make the place more dangerous, but we didn't know that. So they started this experiment, which they've been doing for more than a decade now, and the lead researcher is now at Columbia. His name's Charles Brannis. He's an epidemiologist. And they started kind of, selecting some places to treat, and the treatment meant, boarding up the buildings or putting in the pocket park, and other places they left alone. And they have achieved the most amazing, stunningly powerful findings, which I think deserve to be known much more than they are. So this is really like an invitation for the rest of the world to steal an idea that came from Philadelphia. And I hope that counts. Can you vote for that? I think. What these guys have found over the course of a decade is that when you treat an abandoned building, you reduce gun crime by nearly 40%. And that has been sustained, and that doesn't just, what's happened, I think that deserves applause. That's an amazing thing. And, that's really amazing, because they're not doing it by locking people up. And so the thing is, it's not like the gun crime just moves to the next block, which is what you would worry about. Because it turns out that even though so many of our policies are organized around punishing, treating people, it turns out that if you change the place, you change the situation. And a lot of crime is situational. You remove the situation, and the event doesn't happen. And what's incredible? It's not just that Philadelphia has been able to achieve reductions in crime on those blocks, but also the researchers strap people up to heart rate monitors. And they had people who live in the neighborhoods and know the ecosystem well walk around, and they found that if you live in the neighborhood and you walk by a treated abandoned place, your heart rate hardly changes at all. But if you walk by a place that has been untreated and has those weeds and the debris and who knows what else going on, your heart rate spikes. Why is it that people who live in the most dangerous and depleted neighborhoods also have especially high rates of stress-related diseases, lower life expectancy, right? Well, this is part of the story. Moreover, if you live in a place that's been treated, you feel better about your neighborhood. You're more likely to go out and socialize with your neighbors, you're less likely to die alone in the heat wave, right? And so here's an area, please, like if anyone is here and is not from Philadelphia, will you steal this idea from Philadelphia? And if you're Philadelphia, could you just steal your own damn idea and scale it up on a bigger level? Because like what's so frustrating to me is you see these programs that work really well. Like I write in the book also about the power of community gardens. Like the city I grew up in, Chicago, it has like the most awesome community garden you could find on the roof of City Hall, which no one can use. And the city has invested like almost no public resources in the community gardens all over the poor neighborhoods, which could basically be converted into urban farms because there's so little development there. And so I would love to see the Philadelphias and Chicagos of the world take these extraordinary findings and scale them up and do something, because I truly believe that we don't need a new solution to every problem that's facing us today. A lot of the solutions are right here in front of us. We have the evidence for them. We know how to do it. We just need the political will and the resources to get it done.
So there's an element of design in that project, and I want to talk a little bit about what role design plays in social infrastructure. In your book, you have this other great anecdote about the difference in dropping your kids off at school in New York, where you live, and then in California when you went for a sabbatical. In New York, it's a crowded hallway that you're dropping kids off in a school that can't really accommodate all the parents and kids at drop-off time. In California, it's a little bit more of an orderly car drop-off kind of situation. And in New York, you end up talking with parents and getting to know other kids and that sort of thing. In California, it's a bit more isolating. So this is sort of an example of unintentional social infrastructure that the school has sort of built into it. How should institutions be thinking about social infrastructure, both the kind that they can, clearly design, and the other type that might be sort of unintentional that they could think about?
Yeah, so all infrastructure shapes our social life in some way, right? Even like when you put in a modern water system, it means that people aren't hanging out at the well anymore, collectively. And so we have to figure out what the trade-offs are. We want a certain amount of efficiency, and there's some kinds of efficiency that we're not going to do without. But we can design our systems to be more or less social. So the story you're telling is about this difference I experienced as a parent in Manhattan. I walk my kids to school. It's a really crowded school. It seems like a really kind of junky social infrastructure at first because it's like in an old tenement building. But as it happens, like the school has a policy that you have to be in the classroom with your kid when they're very young for the first 10 or 15 minutes. And then there is this extended sidewalk outside, an unusually large sidewalk area, and all the parents like go from the classroom to the sidewalk and then just kind of hang out with each other. And then because it's a city and there's coffee shops and other places to go, like that conversation moves out. And so it turns out that what appears at first glance to be a not so great social environment is actually a brilliant social infrastructure. And when we went to Stanford for a year and my kids were in a public school in Menlo Park, it was all organized around a driveway with a drop-off. And it was so like amazingly efficient. Like you could never believe how many cars they could get through so parents could drop off their kids so quickly, but you never met anyone else. And it wound up being very isolating, right? And I realized at that time that like efficiency can really be the enemy of good social life. And part of designing social infrastructure is building in some friction, right? Because if we move, and I'm a New Yorker now, like if you're walking too slowly in front of me in the street, I'm very upset with you, like I physically get frustrated, But I also recognize that when I'm hurrying, I miss stuff. And especially what I miss is the chance to get to know people. So I had this amazing experience after Sandy happened, because I've been working on cities and climate and thinking about the design of cities for a long time. And I started, after Sandy happened, I run this thing called the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. And we are thinking a lot about how the university can make more positive contributions to the communities that we're embedded in, whether it's the neighborhood or the city. And I started doing a lot of writing and doing a lot of kind of public events around Sandy and climate change and the future of our cities after that event happened. And I got this call asking me to be the research director for President Obama's Rebuild by Design competition, where they had this international design competition of multidisciplinary teams from around the world who were thinking about, how do you build 21st century infrastructure given the world we're entering into. I don't know if you know this, but there's now federal law that says if you're getting federal money, if you're getting FEMA money for disaster relief, you can't build something better than what was there before. You have to build back what was there before because the federal government doesn't want you to take advantage of their largesse. So our response to climate change is like, well, you have to just put back the same system you had there before, regardless of the fact that now the seas are rising and the heat is stronger. And we were able to break out a different kind of project from the congressional relief bill of a couple $2 billion for this thing called Rebuild by Design. And my job was to show these design teams around the region, because they came from all over the world, and to show them the various needs and vulnerabilities and possibilities in different places. And what I said to all the teams is we're doing climate security now, right? And this is an important thing for Philadelphia to be thinking about, and maybe this is an ideal you can steal. If we do climate security the way we did Homeland Security, we are screwed. And the reason is, if you think about the way we've redesigned our cities since 9/11, and I live very close to the World Trade Center, I'm very sensitive to the vulnerability there, but our response in terms of design and policy was, bollards and barriers and security cameras and checkpoints and all of these things that maybe have made us safer, but have certainly made life feel more fortified and militaristic and unpleasant on a daily basis. I don't know if you do this in Philadelphia. New York, every time I walk into a building, I have to hand someone an ID card. You have to do that here? What are they doing with our IDs? I have no idea what they do with that information. It's very strange, right? There's this whole set of things that now defines the physical order of our cities. If we do this with climate security, we will wind up building these giant walls around the places we live, and they won't work, because it turns out, building a wall, not such a smart idea for water or for people, right? The wall does not work, okay? And so there's got to be a better way to do it. So what I urge the teams in this competition is every time you're building an infrastructure, even if it's designed to keep out this climate threat, which may or may not come in a given year, think about the 360 days a year where everything is basically fine in terms of the weather. And what you've just designed is a system that's going to shape people's daily lives. And if you think about climate infrastructure in terms of social infrastructure as well, radically different design ideas emerge.
So the government can be, in some cases a good force for creating infrastructure, sometimes not. Many of the examples that you have in your book, libraries, parks, these are types of infrastructure that are generally supported by the government or also through philanthropy. But what about when you can't necessarily rely on the government or philanthropy to be supporting kinds of, nascent social infrastructure in cities? Is there a sort of more market-driven approach to social infrastructure that, naturally occurs, or is there a way to sort of show the return on investment such that, other players want to get in on building this kind of infrastructure?
Yeah, well, I think we should take into consideration the real reservations about relying on philanthropy in the private sector that we heard in the panel this morning, and I think they are real, and I do think that ultimately the kinds of challenges that we're facing here for infrastructure are going to require public investments. I don't believe that the philanthropic sector is going to compensate for what we need to do with our governments. That said, I certainly recognize, as someone who studies cities, that a lot of our favorite social infrastructures come from the marketplace, right? So barbershops and hair salons and coffee shops and diners and places like this are gathering places for communities, but how do we make sure that those work best? Well, they have to be open and accessible and welcoming. And unfortunately, when I go around the country and talk about the prime example of a for-profit private sector gathering place that is none of those things, I'm sorry, people, to tell you that Philadelphia is now like Exhibit A, and not because of anything that Philadelphia did, but because of this horrible story of Starbucks from this past year. And it's interesting, like when I was just giving a lecture at Texas about this, and I asked people if they remembered what happened in the Starbucks in Philadelphia, and the guy was like, oh yeah, no, basically no one raised their hand, and one person did, and he said, yeah, a couple guys got kicked out of Starbucks. And I was like, if they had gotten kicked out of Starbucks, it would have been a much better story, right? But the truth is, like, in New York, a group of elderly Koreans in Queens that was eating in a McDonald's every day got kicked out. I do a lot of field work on the Lower East Side, and you find that, like in Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's, there are signs that say no loitering everywhere. And the high-end places that have moved in with gentrification, if you're poor, if you're a person of color, if you're old, you just kind of know in your bones that you're not welcome there, because all those establishments do a lot to signal to people that they're not really for them. So if you're going to have, and you know what happened in Starbucks here, so I don't have to tell you, but the principle is, like, if you're going to have social infrastructure that works well, and it's from the market, it has to be inclusive and open and accessible, right? You have to take cash and not just credit cards, because it turns out not everybody has a credit card. And unfortunately, I don't know that we can always rely on the private sector to do that.
I think we have to wrap up, but I would like to ask one last question, and I have two. So you choose between them. First is the internet has replaced so many of our spaces. People don't even shop at a supermarket anymore. These opportunities for friction, mingling, building social capital are decreasing, it seems, with the internet. So I'm curious to know what you think about that, and maybe there's some way in here that you can add an idea that Philadelphia could steal. That was my last question. Is there something else that we should be thinking about in the city that we should be importing here in terms of social infrastructure, despite the fact that we're, as we talked about before this panel, investing through rebuild in our parks and libraries and a lot of these spaces.
Yeah, which is awesome. And so I guess, like, Philadelphia conceptually seems to be getting this idea, but my understanding is the execution hasn't quite happened yet. And so this is a promise. And so, like, here's one big idea when a city is on the right track: follow up on it. Do it right, because the execution and the maintenance is as important as the ideation. It's not enough to come up with a great idea and throw yourself a high five and go have a beer. You actually have to do the thing right. So I would like to see Philadelphia do the thing right. I guess that's slightly different than do the right thing. So here's and I want to end on this like, Philadelphia is going to be spending money on climate security. Philadelphia is going to have to deal with, like, heat waves here and with flooding events here. And when you design these systems, when you design hard infrastructure to deal with those problems, bear in mind that if you are designing social infrastructure at the same time, like, instead of a seawall, you can explode open the top of that wall and turn it into something like a park or a walking path or a bike path. Like, that's what New York City is doing on the Lower East Side right now. Instead of just building a crude seawall that makes you feel like you're living in a war zone but fighting against the climate, you can actually do the Green New Deal, right? There's an idea for all of us. And there's one person who's excited about the Green New Deal. Philadelphia, come on, join the Green New Deal. You really need this too. And create and make sure that your climate infrastructure is green as well. So why do we all need social infrastructure, and why should we not just think like, oh, Mark Zuckerberg tells us that we can use Facebook and that should be the social infrastructure of the 21st century? And he did that. I mean, now I'm finally getting the hisses that I was looking for earlier. It's like, after the 2016 election, Zuckerberg wrote this letter to the 2 billion Facebook users saying, you used to have, like, community organizations and union halls and churches, and now, like, you've got, thanks to me, Facebook. And that's going to be, I know you laugh, right? But he's serious about this, and unfortunately too many people are. And he said, like, we're going to be your social infrastructure for the 21st century. And the reason that I was very skeptical about this and it made me upset is, like, first of all, I'm I'm always very upset when anyone thinks that like the solution to the biggest social problem of the time is their product. You know, that's always something you should be worried about, with exception for authors, of course. But because you really need to read my book on this. But the real reason that was so kind of odious to hear Zuckerberg telling us that Facebook is where we should go for meaningful social interaction is because no human being on the face of the earth has spent more money on actual social infrastructure than Mark Zuckerberg, with the possible exception of like Larry and Sergey and the people who run Apple. Because if you've ever been to the campuses of the tech giants, they are built by the most incredible architects and engineers of our time. They have every possible physical amenity and social feature that's designed to promote serendipitous encounters and happy work days, like free tempeh for lunch. They will massage you while you're coding. Like everything that one could possibly want in one's physical life, and every trick that architects have for encouraging social interaction is a feature of the Facebook campus. And so for Zuckerberg to tell us, don't worry guys, you've got the internet, and to tell his employees, come work at the technological Shangri-La, is as duplicitous as anything else he's done.
All right, on that note, thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
It's been
Thanks.
a great conversation.